First, a little background on the publication of the work on Douglas's life. Obviously, the book is an exploration of his early life, so there's no need to kind of rehash all of it. But a few things that he may not really have mentioned very explicitly. Um, Obviously, we know his story of how he escaped from slavery and what his earlier life was like as a slave. He goes to New Bedford in Massachusetts in 1838, and by 1841, he was becoming well known enough to be asked to speak at different anti slavery rallies, the first one being in Nantucket. He became, I hate to put it this way, but something of a novelty. You have to put yourself back about 160 years or so, 170 years, in fact, and think the way many of the sort of Caucasian northern citizens, even those who consider themselves more progressive or enlightened, would have thought about a slave speaking. The stereotypes ran rampant. The very idea of having a former slave get up in front of an educated audience and speak is something that probably would have made many of the audience members, no matter how enlightened or progressive they would have been, cringe a little bit. Gosh, how's this going to go? Here's a guy who didn't have the kind of formal educational training and upbringing. Gee, we hope he doesn't kind of fall on his face rhetorically. But once people got to know Douglas, and as you know from reading his biography, autobiography that is, he was self-taught, self-educated, and quite a very well-read person by the time he was in his 30s, and able to speak with the best of them. So the very idea of getting this guy up in front of an audience. Normally at anti-slavery rallies, they would get people who frequently did not have the advantages of education or did not have an opportunity to self-educate, and or just had a very very rudimentary education. So their speaking skills really weren't that great. They weren't professional speakers, obviously, and so it was more of a sort of a here's a guy and here's what he went through, and it's rustic and it's rough and it's not necessarily the most polished presentation, but it's genuine, and we should accept this guy for who he is, and there's a certain kind of admiration for the sort of working class kind of presentation that the guy would or gal would give. So when they trot out Frederick Douglass, who gets up there and can speak better than most politicians, most public speakers of any kind, I mean, it really drew crowds. The speaking career that he had then is what really got him started, and that was not terribly uncommon. Remember that Emerson first started by giving lectures after he left the ministry. Thoreau wanted to have a speaking career. They would travel around to different speaking venues. The Lyceum movement, Lyceum, the Lyceum movement was quite popular in the mid-19th century. Lyceums were places where people would go, and you would go and attend lectures, not religious lectures, but lectures on everything from horticulture to architecture, personal improvement kinds of lectures. Things that public libraries today still do. Sadly, most people don't attend. Or also, not just lyceums, but athenaeums. This is modeled on kind of this classical model of education, self-improvement, all of these sorts of things. So many people, Margaret Fuller and Thoreau and Emerson and all of these guys would give lectures, and were trying to promote a speaking career, and of course, symbiotically, they also wanted to be writers. So their speaking and writing careers dovetailed with one another. You'd come there, you'd hear them speak. You could also purchase the book, or they'd publish a book, and then they'd promote it by going on the speaking circuit. This was just the pattern of Emerson's career through his whole life. That's what he did. You'd get paid for speaking, and then also when people heard you speak and liked what you had to say or were interested, then they might run out and buy the book. So it's a way to get paid twice. Then you would collect your best speeches and you would put them in book form and sell the speeches. So this kind of sort of promotional publishing business aspect of American authorship goes back quite a ways. It's not something that's brand new to today, where authors go on television programs or radio programs and hawk their books. It's been going on like that for quite some time. Now, one of the things you need to know about Frederick Douglass is that unlike Harriet Jacob, who really had to have a lot of help writing her narrative about her early life as a slave. Douglass really didn't need any help whatsoever. And once Douglass got up in front of an audience and was able to speak fluently, speak intelligently, with a great deal of mastery of the language, and then answer questions, there was absolutely no doubt about his having somebody else write the text for him. Jacob, it's still controversial as to whether Harriet Jacob had, to what extent Harriet Jacob actually wrote what she said. She probably had a ghostwriter. She probably had an amanuensis who, she narrated, and one or more women wrote it down in better, more formal, fancy, educated language than Harriet would have probably grown up being able to speak without the advantages of education. But with Douglass, there was no doubt. Once you heard him speak and once you engaged in a conversation with him, you had no doubt that this man wrote his own narrative and that he was the sole author, not influenced by others, because he was an incredibly independent guy. He became one of the most prominent speakers in the U.S. He was probably, if not the best attended speaker, certainly one of the most talked about speakers. There were, of course, some people who were racist who wouldn't go and see a guy who wanted to talk about slavery. And there were a lot of people who, although they were opposed to slavery, thought that bringing up the issue of slavery was something that was just stirring up a hornet's nest. You're just asking for trouble. People have deep-seated feelings. It's kind of people would no more go to a lecture. Some people would no more go to a lecture on slavery or abolition than they would go to a lecture on, say, gun control or abortion or the death penalty or something like that, because there's always a percentage of the population who says, look, you're just going to make people mad by talking about this. So understand that even people in the North sometimes didn't want to have anything to do with the abolitionist movement because they thought they were a bunch of hotheads and troublemakers, and that, of course, depressed interest in the abolitionist movement on the part of many. And many in the North profited indirectly from slavery and its byproducts. If you were in the textile business, for example, you needed cheap cotton. Cheap cotton meant that you made higher profits. And so if all of a sudden you're going to have to pay more for cotton because there is no slavery, well, then that's bad for business, and so on and so forth. Multiply that throughout the economy, and you'll see that the northern manufacturing industries depended quite extensively on inexpensive southern products, commodities. This kind of leads us to this issue of abolition, which I think is very important and hard for many people to understand. Why did slavery persist for so long in the United States when it was outlawed in other countries much sooner than that? And part of the reason is this. Jefferson even struggled with this. The issue of, what do I do? How should I, if I am a slave owner, and let's say you inherit the plantation from Papa, how do I deal with the fact that I now am responsible for all these people? What do I do with them? How can I make the plantation operate? These sorts of economic decisions, but also human decisions. Jefferson is an enigma. People look at Jefferson and say, he lived his entire life opposed to slavery, and he lived his entire life owning slaves. And even when he died, he did not emancipate his slaves, not more than a couple. And the answer in Jefferson's mind, this is certainly no rationalization on for him, or justification, I should say, of his way of thinking, but the rationalization for him was slavery had to be abolished in total, as a whole, because incremental abolition won't work. Individual abolition won't work. If a guy comes along and frees all the slaves on his particular plantation, then suddenly he's at an economic disadvantage. If you then have to start hiring people and paying them to grow your crops, your cost basis is going to be so high that your farm will be out of business within months. In other words, if somebody else is operating on free labor and you're paying your employees, imagine what the price of your goods is going to be. Well, it's going to be so high you can't actually sell them for a profit, and you'll be out of business before too long. So the issue when Jefferson and others said slavery is like having a tiger by the tail, you don't dare let it go, but you also don't want to hang on, is an economic issue, but it's also a human rights issue. The other thing is that he had a sort of a paternalistic view of slavery, and that is, these are folks who have not had the advantages of education or any of these kinds of things. What would they do if you freed them? Now, to our way of thinking, the answer to that would be go live a free life. And I think I think if I were in that position, that's what I want more than anything else. I'll take responsibility for myself. Thank you very much. But the way that some of these white aristocratic Southern planters looked at it was, I'm taking care of these people. Very paternalistic. I'm responsible for these people. They can't take care of themselves. They don't have an education. They're not literate. Never mind the fact that the system that was in place ensured that, as you'll see in Douglas's text. But the fact of the matter is that there were some deep-seated, prejudices there about slavery itself as an institution. It was something that, if it weren't dismantled all at once, it was probably not going to get dismantled. And in fact, Jefferson ended up being right. Unfortunately, we had to go to war and abolish it nationwide. You can't depend on one or two people being, doing the right thing and having that lead to systemic change and the abolition of slavery incrementally. One of the things that the Romantics really believed strongly in, and Thoreau and Emerson and Transcendentalists as well believed, and Hawthorne, even Charles Dickens, who was not a Romantic but a Victorian, believed very much that we shouldn't emphasize large-scale social reform movements organized on the governmental level to achieve lasting change. We should encourage individuals to change themselves, and if enough individuals change themselves, then the society will end up changing from the bottom up rather than the top down. The one thing that we learned about slavery and abolition is that it had to have a top-down solution. You couldn't depend on one or two people starting some sort of movement by emancipating their slaves and expecting that to eradicate such an entrenched and massive system. The other thing that's really interesting that should be brought up here with respect to slavery and to Douglas, one of the things that we find from Douglas is, he lived on the East Coast, of course, in Maryland. Douglas's experience in some ways was typical, but in other ways was not as typical as some of the most horrific aspects of slavery. You read through there and you say there's some just atrocities in here. Yes, and what's surprising is in other parts of the United States, slavery was even more cruel. The sort of factory mass-scale plantations of the Mississippi Delta were just horror scenes. The life expectancy on a Mississippi plantation was just exceedingly low. Because what happened was slavery in, say, the Roman world 2,000 years ago had limitations in some ways. There were some laws that governed slavery. It was no fun being a slave even in the Roman times, believe me. But at the same time, what you had with American slavery that made it so different is a marriage between agriculture and the Industrial Revolution. We had the creation of mass-scale, large-scale factory farms employing human labor. So it wasn't just a situation where, okay, if you're born a slave, your children can achieve citizenship like you would in the Roman world. It wasn't something that was hereditary in the Roman world. It wasn't slaves didn't have a lot of rights, but there were certain things you didn't do or you couldn't do with respect to slaves in the Roman world. But in the American slave system, especially with the factory level farms, where you had thousands of human, basically work units employed in mass agriculture, it became a situation where human beings had been reduced to production elements. And so it was even more dehumanizing than in the Roman world or in many other parts of the world, because the Industrial Revolution and the American West combined and met together with those circumstances. You had this really huge system that had to be dismantled from the top down, not from the bottom up. They didn't realize that in 1830. Still people walking around saying, well, if we can just convince slave owners to give up their slaves one at a time, over time this will change. We look back now and see that there would never have happened. The economic interests were too entrenched for that. The political interests that were funded by the economic interests were too entrenched. A couple of other things. He went on to publish the North Star, which of course is a reference to the escaping slaves moving northward, etc. It was a publication, anti-slavery publication. He was an attendee and speaker at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, a lifelong supporter of women's suffrage. He even met with Lincoln a couple of times during the war to talk about what to do once the war was over and how to deal with emancipation and integration of African Americans in American society. At one of those meetings, Lincoln even suggested that the state of Florida be set aside as a haven for African Americans, the way Oklahoma was designated as Indian Territory. Most African Americans rejected that notion quite handily, and in fact, probably with good reason, seeing as how we saw exactly what happened to so-called Indian Territory with Oklahoma. That didn't last very long until settlers kind of came in there and took a lot of that away. He also met with President Johnson, after the war, but continued his lecturing and speaking and writing career all the way up to his death in 1895.